I live in Burke County, North Carolina, in Morganton. I'm used to the quiet lifestyle that comes with living in a rural place. You get some weird characters here and there, but it's usually nothing too bad. I own a nice plot of land with my husband. My work schedule fluctuates. Sometimes I work days, sometimes I work nights. This happened on a night that I was on my way home after a night shift, so it had to be like 4 a.m. My phone was almost dead. I was hungry. I was tired, and I just wanted to get some food and head home. I stopped at the gas station to get $10 worth of gas and also a packaged sandwich, which I proceeded to eat inside the gas station cafe. Some sketchy guy was eyeing me for a little until he left the building without buying anything. After eating, I went outside to fill up the gas and then got back in the car. The smell of gas was extra pungent for some reason. These roads are very dark and twisty at night, so I was driving slow, especially since I was tired after a long day of work. Then something unexpected happened. The needle on the gas gauge suddenly dropped to E, and the low gas light came on and beeped. I had no idea what was going on. I'm not a car person and I'd never run out of gas before this. Plus, the needle just suddenly dropped. I thought at first that the computer was glitching, so I pulled over and restarted the car, but the needle was still on E. I tried to continue driving, but the engine died. I started having a panic attack. I called my husband first thing, and thank God he picked up. I asked him how did my car run out of gas after I just filled up, and as I got out of the car, I smelt gasoline. I told him this, and he said it sounds like I have a leak. He told me he'd head right over and he'd call our roadside assistance company. But then I heard a car coming with no headlights, and suddenly it stopped not far behind my car. I suddenly thought to bring up that sketchy guy who was watching me at the gas station and asked my husband if there was a chance he did something to my car. My husband's tone suddenly changed to sounding more concerned and worried. He said yes, there's a chance that he may have cut my fuel line. I didn't know what that meant. All I knew was I needed to run. I took my keys out of the ignition and shut the door and locked it so that the headlights would turn off. My phone was on like 2%, so I told him to text me when he's close. I ran off the road and towards the first house I could find. I ran down the long driveway and up the property to the front door. All the lights in the house were off. I still rang the bell multiple times anyway. Eventually, a light turned on and then the door opened. A man in his 60s opened the door. He looked like he was just woken up. I asked him to let me in to hide and charge my phone. After a bit of explaining, he opened the door fully and let me in. I asked him for an iPhone charger, and he said he'd go look for one, then asked me to take a seat in the living room. I sat down, still in my nurse scrubs, feeling a mix of emotions. The man called out from the kitchen asking me if I wanted some water. I said yes, please. Little did he know, I saw his reflection in a mirror in the living room that gave visibility into the kitchen. I saw him fill a cup with water, then I know for a fact I saw him drop something into the water. He walked out of view of the mirror, but the faucet was still running. It ran for a solid 30 more seconds before he turned it off. He came back into the living room with a glass of water and handed it to me. I thanked him, and he sat down and just looked at me, then asked me to explain the situation again. I replied to him, I just really need a charger so that I could contact my husband. He said all right and went upstairs. I checked my phone, and it was on 1%. I used that remaining battery to send my current location to my husband just in case. I then smelt the glass of water, and although it didn't smell like anything, I knew he put something in it. Now I had to make the decision of whether I should leave or not. On one hand, I needed to charge my phone badly. On the other, I was 99% sure he did something to this water. I heard him walking back down the stairs, and he said he doesn't have any iPhone chargers since he has an Android. After he said this, I got up and walked straight for the door. I'm not an idiot. Once outside, I ran back down the driveway to the road. I felt like throwing up. I couldn't believe 2 separate potential incidents from 2 different men happened in one night. I crept along the side of the road behind the trees. I took out my phone and sent my updated location, and right around now was when my battery died. I waited until I saw the familiar headlights of my husband's truck. I went out waving my arms, and thank God it was him. I got inside the truck and let all my emotions out, crying to him about what I just went through. He brought us to my car, and there was no longer a car behind mine. My back window was shattered, though, and it appeared someone had gotten into the back seat, but nothing of high value was left in my car to steal anyway. My car battery was also now dead. When I told my husband about the man who tried to potentially drug me, he was so furious he wanted to go break down his door. But I told him no, let's just wait for the tow truck to come. We waited quite a while before it came. My car was towed to my dealership, where they would take the car in the next day. My husband was right. My car was vandalized, and the fuel line was cut completely. Thank God I was off the next few days because I needed some time to mentally recover from this night. The idea that twice in one night I was almost a victim of some sketchy men, I just couldn't get over. We started in New Jersey, where we're from, and made our way west. It was a great time. We saw stuff that we always talked about seeing. After day 3, we finally hit the dreaded boring part of the drive, Nebraska. Nothing but cornfields as far as the eye can see. It was about 6:30 p.m., and the sun was starting to set. I looked at the gas gauge, and it read 1/4 of a tank. I told my buddy we should start looking for a gas station. He checked the GPS, and nothing for at least 100 miles showed up. I started to get nervous because the last thing we need is to run out of gas in the middle of Nebraska with literally nothing around at night. That's how horror movies start. Finally, as we crested a small hill, my fears, at least for the time being, were put to rest. Down the road, maybe half a mile, we saw a blue sign that said, "Gas next exit." Little did I know that the next exit was another 30 miles away. So we drove and drove, all the while with one eye on the gauge. Finally, we saw the exit and got off. The gas light on the dashboard came on, warning us we had less than a gallon left. The sign pointed to the right at the end of the exit ramp and said, 10 miles gas. The car we were driving was a 200 Ford Explorer. Being an old SUV, I knew it barely got 14 miles to the gallon on a good day. I shared a look with my friend, we both shrugged. I made the turn, and we continued on. The sun had now gone down, and for those of you who have never been to the Midwest at night, it's not like being in the city. When the sun goes down, there is no ambient light whatsoever. No street lights, no lights from a major city giving off the comfortable orange glow, nothing. Just an endless darkness in all directions. Even the highway offered no lights. I turned on the high beams and could barely see 50 feet in front of me. My spider sense was tingling at this point, but we pressed on. What other choice did we have? Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. I kept my eyes peeled for any possible animals that might dart out in front of me. Suddenly, the car started to shudder. My friend and I both shared an "oh, look" as we started going up another hill. The car barely made it up and crested the hill. As we did, we saw our salvation, lights from a gas station. If I had only known what was going to happen next, I would have gotten out of the car and run back to the interstate. We rolled down the hill and entered what I can only describe as a ghost town. There were buildings, shops, and houses, every single one of them boarded up. There was one exception, a church sat opposite the station. One of those old ones you would usually see in New York or Paris. It appeared to be sandstone with a huge steeple. It looked like it was brand new, with a nicely manicured lawn and a huge red wooden door. The stained glass windows that lined the outside had pictures telling a story. However, instead of telling the story of the Stations of the Cross or the Virgin Mary, as most churches had, these showed depictions of people burning in fire, their faces twisted in agony under the cloven hoof of what I could only think was the devil. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something here just didn't feel right. The car died about 500 feet from the gas station, so we got out and pushed it the rest of the way. As we got out, I heard something barely audible, almost like a humming, coming from the church. My buddy didn't hear anything, so I assumed I must just be tired. The pump was new, with one of the credit card readers. Which struck me as odd, considering everything else in this town, save the church, looked like it hadn't had anyone living in it for at least 30 years. We filled up without incident, and as we finished, the sound, which now sounded like a humming droning, got louder. We got back into the car and left. The road we came in on was a one-way, so the only way out was to go further into the town and hopefully find a road that led back to the interstate. As we drove, we saw more light being reflected off the buildings. We pulled into a town square where there was a huge stage and hundreds of chairs set up for what looked like a concert of some sort. The light was coming from a bonfire in the center of the audience area. As we pulled further into the square, we could see a guy playing music for no one. There wasn't one person in any of the seats. I used to work in the music industry. I know a sound check when I see one. Usually, that happens before the concert, so a musician can check his or her sound with the guy running the soundboard. With no one around, this was not it. He was covered in sweat, screaming his music and playing almost like his life depended on it. We came to a T intersection and a stop sign. We had the windows down because it was summer and we were trying to save gas by not using the AC. The droning humming I heard had gotten louder. It was almost like it was in my head, beating my brain. Now it sounded like it was coming from the buildings themselves. It got louder and louder. The guy playing music screamed even louder, almost like he was fighting the sound. Then a whole lot of things happened at once. The humming reached fever pitch and then stopped abruptly. The bonfire went out. The guy on stage stopped playing. Down on the right of the road, which looked like it was the only way back to the highway, came a mob of people with pitchforks, boards, rocks, and one guy had what looked like a samurai sword. Looking back now, I remember thinking it strange that no one had a gun considering where we were. They came running towards us, screaming and waving their weapons. My buddy and I covered our heads in anticipation of the beating of our lives. They started pounding on the car, even going so far as to break one of the little windows in the back seat. I threw the car in four-wheel drive and slammed the accelerator. The car lurched forward, plastering a few people onto the windshield, but ultimately we broke through the mob. The ones who weren't knocked down from the impact of the car started storming the stage. They jumped onto it and started assaulting the musician with their weapons, his screams echoing off the derelict buildings. I didn't waste any time. I slammed on the gas pedal, cut the wheel, and sped out down the road to the right, the whole time with my friend screaming obscenities. We got back to the highway and drove for another 30 miles until we hit our destination for the night, where our hotel was. We got into our room, trying to make sense of what we had just seen. As I put my bags down, I looked at my friend and he looked at me. We both agreed to go to the police in the morning, as it was now about 3 a.m. The next day, we woke up, packed our overnight bags, and went out to our car. We immediately drove to the police department and asked to speak to a detective, as we had a crime to report. A small bald man from a desk stood up and invited us to come and sit with him. We then proceeded to tell him the whole thing. When we were finished, he asked us, pale as a ghost, "Did you tell anyone else this?" We, of course, responded in the negative, to which he replied, "Good. Keep it that way." With his hands shaking, he showed us the door, and we left. We never spoke of it to anyone else. Our next story takes us from the desolate expanse of the desert to the claustrophobic darkness of a dense forest. Imagine the towering trees, their branches intertwined overhead, creating a canopy that blots out the moon and stars. The air is thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a symphony of rustling leaves and the snapping of twigs. It's a place of eerie beauty, but also one that can hide unspeakable horrors. A young woman driving home from a late-night shift found herself lost on a deserted road cutting through the heart of such a forest. She had taken a wrong turn, lured off the main highway by a faulty GPS signal. Now she was hopelessly lost, her phone showing no bars, and her car sputtering its last breaths as it ran out of gas. The engine died, plunging her into an oppressive silence broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped her heart. The forest, once beautiful, now loomed around her, menacing and alive. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sounded like approaching footsteps. She knew staying in her car was her safest bet, but the silence of the forest was unbearable, a suffocating blanket of darkness pressing in on her. She turned on her hazard lights, there blinking a beacon of hope in the vast darkness, but the battery quickly drained, leaving her once again in darkness. Time crawled by, each minute an eternity. She dozed off, only to be jolted awake by nightmares fueled by her isolation and fear. The forest came alive with every gust of wind, the shadows seeming to dance and writhe, taking on menacing shapes in the darkness. Then she heard it, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from the woods surrounding her car. Her blood ran cold, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drum. She strained to listen, her senses on high alert, every muscle in her body tense with fear. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the distinct sound of heavy footsteps crunching on leaves. Something was out there, something big and dangerous, circling her car like a predator stalking its prey. She locked the doors, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the lock. She huddled in the back seat, her eyes wide with terror, her breath catching in her throat. The growls continued throughout the night, each one sending shivers down her spine. She was trapped, hunted by an unseen terror in the heart of the forest. As dawn broke, the growls finally ceased, replaced by the chirping of birds, a jarring contrast to the nightmare she had just endured. She cautiously got out of the car, her legs shaking and her body trembling with exhaustion and terror. She didn't waste any time. With a desperate prayer, she started walking, her eyes scanning the dense undergrowth and her ears straining for any sound that might signal the return of her unseen tormentor. After what felt like an eternity, she stumbled out of the woods and onto a dirt road. A pickup truck soon approached, its driver stopping to help. She had escaped the clutches of the forest, but the terror of that night, the memory of the unseen growls, would forever haunt her dreams. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.